Having a good time with these new Sherlock Holmes mysteries? If you want to help the channel thrive, hop over to our Patreon. You will get to hear our stories way before the rest of YouTube does. Every bit of financial support helps us keep making these videos for you. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. The end of March had arrived with a raw, driving rain that lashed relentlessly against the panes of our Baker Street windows. It was a miserable, soul-chilling morning, the sort of weather that kept most of London indoors, huddled beside their hearths. Yet our morning peace was shattered by a visitor whose frantic arrival suggested a crisis of the highest order. My friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was hunched over his chemical bench, his sharp profile etched against the grey, dismal light, as he tended to a particularly foul-smelling retort that bubbled with an ominous greenish liquid. The air in our sitting room was a thick, unpleasant mixture of those sulphuric fumes and the pungent, familiar scent of my own tobacco. I sat nearby in my armchair, attempting to focus on my medical notes regarding the long-term effects of tropical diseases, a tedious task made nearly impossible by the rhythmic rattling of the window panes in the gale. Our caller was a man of roughly 60 years, dressed in a heavy velvet-collared overcoat of the finest wool, marking him as a man of considerable substance in the city. Despite his prosperous attire and the expensive gold chain that looped across his middle, his features were pinched with a distress that bordered on the frantic. This was Mr. Alastair Finch, a senior partner at the Provident Bank, an institution long regarded as a pillar of financial stability and Victorian probity. All of his professional composure had vanished, replaced by a raw, naked anxiety. His eyes were wide, with a genuine terror darting around the room as if he expected his very ruin to manifest from the shadows of our cluttered corners. To a man like Finch, a scandal was more than a setback. It was a total annihilation of the life he had built. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped, his gloved hand trembling violently as he reached for the edge of a chair. "I beg for your help. Something truly impossible has happened at the bank. A man, a client of immense standing and international reputation, has vanished from within the confines of a locked room." Holmes gave a weary sigh, though he finally turned away from his experiments, the pipette still held in his long, stained fingers. The light in his eyes had changed. The dullness of his morning boredom was replaced by that keen, investigative gleam I knew so well. "Vanished, Mr. Finch? That is a bold claim to bring to a man of logic. In this universe, matter does not simply cease to be. Please sit and tell us the facts of the matter in their proper order." "Watson, I think our guest requires a restorative. His heart is racing like a hunted hare. He looks as though he might collapse before he finishes his first sentence." Once he had caught his breath and sipped the brandy I provided, Mr. Finch began a story that would have seemed fantastic had it come from any other source. "It concerns the Paradol chamber, our most secure and private vault. It is a room designed for absolute seclusion, used by our wealthiest and most eccentric clients when they require total privacy for their most delicate transactions. The walls are lined with plates of reinforced steel, and the door is a massive 4-inch thick affair that would resist any drill or explosive known to the criminal trade. It is guarded constantly by 2 armed men and represents the very height of our security, the jewel in the crown, of the Provident Bank. He paused to steady his voice, which threatened to crack. Yesterday, at 2:15, we were visited by Mr. Silas Pemberton, the diamond merchant. He is a man of great wealth, if somewhat difficult and secretive temperament. He carried a locked leather briefcase and insisted on entering the chamber alone to inspect a new shipment of rough stones he intended to deposit with us. As the senior partner, I escorted him myself to ensure the utmost protocol. I saw him enter with the case in his hand, and I personally turned the heavy brass key twice in the lock. There is no way to lock or unlock that door from the inside. Once it is shut and the bolt is thrown, the occupant is entirely dependent on those of us in the corridor for his liberty. Finch gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white against the dark leather. He was meant to emerge at 2:45. When the time came, I returned with the guards to open the door. To our utter horror and bewilderment, we found the room was empty. There was no sign of Pemberton, no struggle, no discarded clothing. Nothing, yet his distinctive briefcase was sitting undisturbed in the very centre of the oak table, exactly where one might have expected him to place it. He had simply gone, as if he had dissolved into the stagnant, airless atmosphere of the vault. The account left me speechless. A man cannot simply evaporate from a steel-lined room with a single guarded exit and no windows. I looked to Holmes, expecting some sign of scepticism, or perhaps a wry comment on the reliability of bank locks. But he merely sat with his chin in his hands, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, thoughtful pattern against his knee. What of the police, Mr. Finch?" Holmes asked, his tone remarkably level, as if he were discussing the price of consols. "Lestrade has been there since the alarm was raised yesterday afternoon," Finch replied, a shudder passing through him. "His men have spent the night searching every square inch of that chamber with the tenacity of terriers. They have sounded the walls with mallets and pulled up sections of the panelling to check for voids. They are completely at a loss, Mr. Holmes. Some of the younger constables are even whispering about the supernatural or the work of spirits. If this becomes public, the bank's reputation is finished. We cannot survive the idea that our vaults are insecure, or worse, that they're haunted by vanishing merchants." "I see," Holmes said, rising and reaching for his heavy overcoat. "The impossible is frequently the result of a flaw in the observer's perspective, or a failure to account for all the variables. Watson, I suggest you put on your boots and bring your service revolver. The city is calling, and the weather is unforgiving. Mr. Finch, we shall go to this Paradol chamber at once. In my experience, London's ghosts usually turn out to be flesh and blood with a very clever plan and a very human motive." The hansom cab ride through the relentless rain was a cold and dismal affair. The great soot-stained buildings of the city loomed through the mist like grey monuments to commerce. The Provident Bank was a particularly formidable structure of granite and iron, looking every bit the unassailable fortress its partners claimed it to be. Its massive pillars and heavy doors were designed to inspire a sense of permanence and safety in the minds of the depositors. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable anxiety. Clerks spoke in hushed, furtive tones, and the usual bustle of banking had been replaced by an uneasy, watchful silence. Inspector Lestrade met us in a side corridor, his face drawn and tired, his collar wilted from a night of fruitless labour. "I'm glad you're here, Holmes," he said, his voice unusually subdued and lacking its typical braggadocio. This case is enough to make a man believe in the occult. We've spent 14 hours in that room. There are no secret doors, no loose stones, and no hidden vents larger than a mouse hole. It is as solid a block of masonry and steel as you'll find in the whole of England. We've checked the roof and the foundations, and there's simply no way out. Finch led us past several ornate transaction rooms, decorated with mahogany and brass, to a more secluded and functional wing of the building. The door to the Paradol chamber was a stark, functional slab of grey steel, with hinges that looked strong enough to hold the weight of a drawbridge. It looked less like an office and more like the entrance to a tomb. Holmes approached the entrance with a quiet, intense focus. He didn't just look at the door. He seemed to interrogate it, running his long fingers over the cold metal and using a magnifying glass to inspect the minute accumulation of dust in the hinges. He spent several minutes examining the strike plate and the heavy bolt, his eyes narrowed in deep thought. The engineering is standard for a high-security vault if exceptionally heavy and well-maintained, he remarked to the air. It is a fine piece of work, but it follows traditional rules of weight, leverage and locksmithing. We must remember, Lestrade, that the human mind often sees a door and assumes its only function is to open and close on its hinges. We limit ourselves by our own definitions. The room itself was small, perhaps 10 feet square, and panelled in dark, polished oak that gleamed under the gaslight. The heavy table in the centre still held the briefcase, now tagged with the police evidence label. A pair of ornate gaslights provided a flickering yellow glow that danced across the walls, creating long, shifting shadows. The air was heavy, smelling faintly of cold metal, old paper, and the lingering scent of Pemberton's expensive cologne. Holmes moved through the room with a focused, almost predatory energy. He knelt at the threshold, examining the floor where the oak planks met the steel doorframe with microscopic intensity. He moved to the walls, tapping the wood and pressing his ear against the panelling to listen for any hollow response or mechanical resonance. He spent a long time looking at the ceiling, tracing the brass pipes that fed the gaslights back to their source in the plasterwork. Lestrade watched him with a weary sort of patience, leaning against the cold steel of the doorframe. "Well, Holmes, do you find anything that my 12 men missed in their 3 exhaustive sweeps of the place? We've tapped every board and measured every wall twice over." Holmes stood up and brushed his hands together, a small cloud of dust rising from his knees. "I see a room designed specifically to feel like the safest place in London, a psychological fortress. I see a briefcase that has been placed with a very deliberate, almost theatrical care. And I see that Mr. Silas Pemberton is indeed missing from this stage." He walked to the table and circled it slowly. "Mr. Finch, you mentioned Pemberton was a man of habit. Was he remarkably precise in his movements? Did he value symmetry and order in his physical surroundings?" "He was famously so, Mr. Holmes. He had a ritual for almost everything he did, from the way he cut his cigars to the way he arranged his ledgers. He was a man who detested chaos in any form." Holmes nodded, his eyes fixed on the briefcase. "A man like that does not leave a valuable case behind by accident or in a moment of panic. It was left here to serve a specific purpose, to act as a focal point for our attention. Now tell me, was there any sound, however muffled, or any flicker of light while he was inside? Did the guards report even a momentary distraction? Finch thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. The guards heard nothing, sir. It was perfectly eerily silent within the corridor. They swear they never left their post for a second. And when you opened the door at the end of the half-hour, did you feel a draught? Any subtle change in the air pressure or a sudden scent of the damp? I was in such a state of shock that I might have missed the finer details, Finch admitted, his voice low. But the air felt much as it does now, cold, heavy, and perfectly still. Holmes returned to the centre of the room and knelt again, his ear pressed directly to the floorboards. He felt the surface of the wood with a delicate, searching touch, moving his hand in wide arcs. Lestrade, when you tapped the floor with your mallets, what exactly did you hear? Be precise. It sounded solid as a rock, Holmes. There's no hollow space beneath those boards. I'd stake my pension on it. The sound was flat and dead. That is very interesting indeed, Holmes murmured, a ghost of a smile appearing on his lips. Lestrade, I believe you can stop looking for hidden doors or secret panels. Instead of searching for what has been added to the room, we should consider the latent, forgotten capabilities of the chamber itself. Watson, we have seen enough here to form the basis of a hypothesis. Mr. Finch, I need the original architectural drawings of this building from its founding, and more importantly, the schematics for the gas and water lines. Have them sent to my rooms by special messenger immediately. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spent the entire afternoon and well into the evening surrounded by a sea of maps and dusty blueprints. He traced the lines of the building's ancient foundations with a focused intensity, his magnifying glass never far from his hand as he cross-referenced the bank's layout with the city's subterranean history. I sat by the fire, nursing a glass of port and trying to find some shred of logic in the vanishing merchant. "It makes no sense, Holmes," I said eventually, breaking the long silence. "Could he have hidden in the briefcase? It is large, but not large enough for a grown man. Or perhaps it was a trick of the gaslight, some clever arrangement of mirrors." Holmes didn't look up from his maps, his eyes darting between two different drawings. "The problem lies in our fundamental assumption that the room is a static, immovable object. In our minds, a room is a fixed point in space. But if we stop thinking of it as a box and start thinking of it as a machine, the mystery begins to unravel with remarkable speed." "But Lestrade said the floor was solid. He hammered on it himself." "A simple trapdoor would be easy to find because of the void beneath it. We are looking for something much more integrated into the very skeleton of the bank," Holmes explained, tapping a section of the blueprints with his pencil. "Look at this, Watson. There is a pneumatic regulator specifically designed for the Paradol chamber installed 40 years ago. And the control valve for that regulator is located in the adjacent strongroom, a restricted area where only the senior staff and the engineers ever go." He stood up and began to pace the rug, his hands clasped behind his back. "Consider the gaslights once more. In an old building with its own internal piping, the pressure often varies. A sudden dimming of the lights is a common, tiresome occurrence in London, and most people would ignore it as a mere nuisance of the municipal supply. But what if that dimming was not a failure of pressure, but a deliberate signal for a mechanical process? The truth began to dawn on me, though it seemed almost too elaborate to be true. "You mean the entire floor moved? Without a sound?" "Exactly. The Paradol chamber sits directly over an old sub-basement that was part of an earlier structure, a void that isn't even on the modern municipal maps. These blueprints show a hydraulic system designed decades ago for the movement of heavy maintenance equipment. The floor of that room isn't resting on dirt or stone, it's resting on massive solid steel pillars that extend deep into the earth. That is why it sounded solid to Lestrade's mallets. It wasn't a hollow space, it was a solid platform of oak and steel weighing several tons, supported by the very foundations of the building. He jabbed a finger at the drawings, his eyes alight with triumph. The drop in gas pressure was the trigger. The platform lowered Pemberton into the darkness of the sub-basement in near silence, then returned to its place and locked itself back into the frame before the gas pressure was restored. To anyone outside, nothing had changed, and the room appeared as solid as ever. But Pemberton was already long gone, moving through the forgotten tunnels that snake beneath the city. So he planned his own escape, with the help of someone inside, I exclaimed. He had every reason to. He left the briefcase as a clever distraction, a red herring to keep the police focused on the impossible nature of the room while he made his way to safety. Holmes reached for the briefcase, which he had borrowed from the yard under the promise of a swift return. Using a small set of professional tools from his waistcoat, he worked the lock with the skill of a master thief, until it opened with a distinct metallic click. He poured out several heavy velvet bags onto our table, but instead of the rough diamonds Finch had expected, they contained only worthless, expertly cut pieces of quartz that caught the firelight. "Pemberton is utterly bankrupt, Watson. He used this shipment of diamonds to stage a final dramatic act that would allow him to disappear before his creditors and the law caught up with him. He wanted the world to believe he had met some mysterious end. But even a man as careful as he can leave a trail when he is in a hurry." He felt along the interior lining of the case, his fingers searching for a seam, and ripped away a small section of dark silk, revealing a hidden pocket. Inside was a crumpled passenger receipt for a steamship leaving Southampton for South America that very evening. It was made out to a Mr. Silas Merton, a transparent anagram of his own name. He was in such a hurry to swap the cases and descend into the tunnels that he forgot this one vital detail, Holmes said, grabbing his hat. "We have just enough time to reach the docks before the tide turns, and he sails beyond our reach." That evening we returned to the bank with a stunned Mr. Finch and a very sceptical Lestrade, who still couldn't believe his mallets had failed him. Holmes led us to the strong room and turned the heavy brass valve he had identified in the old drawings. We watched through the open door of the Paradol chamber as the gaslights hissed loudly and dimmed to a faint, ghostly blue glow. With a heavy, vibrating mechanical groan that shook the very walls, the floor began to sink smoothly into the ground, revealing a dark, cavernous shaft that led deep into the forgotten foundations of the bank. The engineering was a relic of a past age, forgotten by all but those who sought to use it for ill. "Your security was undone by your own history, Mr. Finch," Holmes said quietly, as the floor began its slow ascent back to the surface. "Pemberton found an accomplice in your maintenance staff who knew about this old neglected machinery and saw a way to profit from it. Lestrade acted with admirable speed. He telegraphed the harbour police at once, and we arrived in Southampton just as the SS Sud-America was preparing to cast off its moorings. Silas Pemberton was caught on the gangway, his pockets full of embezzled bearer bonds, and his face disguised by a freshly dyed beard and a heavy travelling cloak. He looked less like a merchant prince, and more like the desperate fugitive he had become. Later that night, back in the quiet firelit sanctuary of Baker Street, Holmes sat with his pipe as the wind outside finally began to fade into a soft moan. The case was closed, the bonds recovered, and the reputation of the bank, for now, saved. "It was a clever piece of theatre, Watson," he said through a thick cloud of blue smoke, his features relaxing into an expression of quiet contentment. "We spent our time looking for a man who could walk through walls, and found instead a man who could simply move the floor beneath his feet. The most effective deceptions are usually the ones that take advantage of our most basic assumptions, the things we take so much for granted that we never think to question them." He turned back to his chemicals, his mind already moving on to the next problem, while I sat and marvelled at the sheer audacity of the diamond merchant and the quiet, relentless brilliance of the man who had caught him in the act of vanishing. The game is always afoot. Do not forget to check out our Patreon before you go.